Hey guys, today I'm making a recipe that you're either gonna like or you're not. We're making an easy gluten-free meatloaf. Now, we really like it the day of dinner. We really like it for leftovers. We actually have it about once a month or so because we like it so much. Ground beef is still relatively inexpensive compared to other cuts of meat, so it's a good dinner for us. But no dry meatloaves here. Today, we're gonna make an easy, juicy meatloaf that should please just about anyone. I'm Jamie with SavorySaver. I share gluten-free recipes, tips, tricks, and resources to make your gluten-free lifestyle easier. So please consider hitting that subscribe button and let's get started. So for my meatloaf, the first thing I like to do is get my pan ready. I've got a baking sheet here that I've covered with aluminum foil. I like to try to keep the pan underneath as clean as I can, even though there's a hole over here and I'm still gonna get some grease under here, but hopefully more will stay on the aluminum foil than on the pan. So I've got that covered. I'm gonna put that over to the side. The next thing I like to do is get my breadcrumbs ready. So this is straight from the freezer. This is all the bread ends that Tara does not eat from her gluten-free bread. There's some bread in here that I made that wasn't a great recipe or it started getting old, so I broke it up and put it in here. This is where I keep all the bread that we don't really eat or aren't going to eat. There's some pieces that are partial. Then when I need it, I'll pop a piece or two out of the freezer and use it as breadcrumbs, or if we want to do croutons or something like that. So don't throw away those recipes that didn't come out or those bread ends. They're great to use in your cooking. So I've got 2 slices of bread, and that's gonna go into a 1.5 pounds of ground chuck, which is 80-20. As far as ingredients for this recipe, guys, the ingredients I use are all in the link below, and I'll try to put them in the description as well. Amounts will vary. This is actually right at 1.5 pounds, but if I have a smaller amount, of course, I adjust everything down a little bit. So I'm gonna give you amounts as best I can, but be sure to check out the description for amounts that coincide with 1.5 pounds in case I have any of them wrong. So a couple pieces of bread, and I just like to tear it into pieces, or you can use the food processor, whatever you wanna do. And we just wanna break it up. Just use a small bowl. While we're talking breadcrumbs, the other thing I like to do is I usually have some kind of packaged gluten-free breadcrumbs on hand. I usually have these out just in case when I'm mixing it looks too wet. I will add a little bit of those because once I've torn up bread for the recipe, I'm not gonna probably tear up another slice. We've got those all torn up, and some of the pieces are pretty big. I don't mind if there's a little bit of bread in the meatloaf showing. If you want them smaller than that, by all means, you can do that. Once everything is torn up and into the bowl, we need to moisten this a little bit, which is gonna help keep the meatloaf moist as well. For that, I'm gonna use a little milk today, about a 1/4 cup or so. We just want everything to be sucked up into the bread and maybe just a little bit of liquid down the bottom left. Use milk, use 50/50, heavy cream. Almond milk would probably work if that's what you have. So we just want to add some of that in there. We're gonna let the bread soften. So I'm gonna put that off to the side for now and move on with my next step. The next thing that helps keep this gluten-free meatloaf juicy is I like to add a little bit of fresh vegetable to it. So I've got about 1/4 to 1/3 of a bell pepper. This is a yellow one. Most of the time I use red, but if you didn't have red or yellow or orange, use green. But I do like bell pepper in it, so I'm gonna use about 1/2 to 1/3 of that. I also have about 1/4 of a small onion that I finely diced. I'm going to use that, and 2 to 3 garlic cloves. And that's all to taste. If you don't have garlic and want to use garlic powder, by all means, you can do that. But this is what I'm going to use. And I don't want them to be raw at the end. So let's move over to the stove and I'll show you what I do to those and then we'll keep moving forward. So we're over at the stove. I have a small saute pan here and I've got about a tablespoon of olive oil in there and I'm just warming that up over medium heat. And once that's heated, I'm gonna add the peppers and the onions and saute them just until they start to soften. And we'll give those a few minutes to do that. Let's put those in. They don't have to be totally soft. You just want them to start softening so they actually finish cooking in the oven. Once these have gone about 3 to 4 minutes and they're almost ready to be turned off, we'll add our garlic, give it a stir, and then at that point you can turn your stove off because we do want this to cool just for a couple minutes and not be super hot when it goes into the mix. All right, let's get our garlic added. Stir it around and turn off the heat. That'll finish the garlic. Now we also want to turn our oven on, so I'm going to bump it on to 375 degrees. And we will start getting that warmed up. Now let's move this off of the burner so it can cool a little bit. Got that cooling off, and we're going to move back over to the counter. So while our vegetables are cooling just for a minute or two, I'm going to start making our seasoning that goes into the meatloaf. I like to make it in a separate bowl, that way everything gets mixed up well before it goes into the meatloaf, and I don't spend a lot of time mixing the meatloaf together because we don't want that meat to get tough. So I've got 1 egg in here, and I just want to beat that up. And if you're using 2 pounds of beef, you may want to try a couple eggs. I have found that 1 egg works well for me for the most part. Once you've beaten up that egg, we can add some more seasonings to it. So I'm going to add some salt, of course. You want about a teaspoon, especially for, that much beef. You want to make sure it's seasoned well. I usually go a 1/4 teaspoon to 1/2 teaspoon of pepper. I usually, for most cooking recipes, especially like this, I do whatever my salt is. As far as an amount, I do 1/2 of that in pepper. You adjust that as you like. I'm gonna add some parsley, about a teaspoon of dried parsley. If I have fresh on hand, lots of times I'll chop up a tablespoon or so of that and add that instead. I'm going to add a little bit of Italian seasoning, which has parsley in it, but it also has thyme and oregano and basil. So I'm going to add a little bit of that, about 3/4 teaspoon or so. Next, I'm going to add a good splash of Worcestershire sauce. Make sure it says gluten-free or that there are no gluten ingredients on it. Lee & Perrins, I think, is listed as gluten-free. I'm not sure about French's. I think it is, but I'm not positive. This is actually from Lidl, but there's nothing in it that Tara can't have, so I'm going to use that. This is just going to bump up that beefiness. Give everything a good mix. And again, this is so when we add it to the meatloaf, it's already all mixed well and we just need to disperse it throughout the beef. Next, you can either add your breadcrumbs or your vegetables if they're cool. So what I like to do is, there's a little bit of milk in the bottom. I will probably use that as well, but I'm gonna take my bread now and I'm just gonna crush it and mash it into the mix. If you don't like dealing with the mushy bread or the raw meat, grab a pair of gloves and put those on. That's what Tara does if she's cooking. Once all that's in there, I'm gonna add that little bit of milk and that little bit of breadcrumb in there. Let's get rid of that bowl. Let's give this another mix before we add our vegetables. Mash up that bread a little more. And guys, I know this is extra steps, but I really feel that it helps the end result of your meatloaf as far as flavor being everywhere, as far as the moisture being everywhere. It's not gonna dry out. So there's our mix there. Now let's add our vegetables. I'm gonna add all of that in there. It's all softened, it's cooled just a little bit. Another mix. Now we have everything mixed up. Now we need to add it to our beef and give it a mix. And if I think that the meatloaf mix at that point is too wet, I'll add a little bit of the dried breadcrumbs and we'll adjust it if needed. But let's see what this does. Okay, into the bowl. Again, one thing about meatloaf is it can get tough if it's overworked. So we're gonna try to minimize that. Let's open up these to have them ready in case we need it. I do try to use one hand so I have a clean hand if I need to add breadcrumbs. So give it a good mix. Guys, leave me in the comments below what you use as fillers or as in place of regular breadcrumbs in your meatloaf. Do you use gluten-free oats? Do you use potato flakes? Do you not use anything at all? Leave me in the comments below what you like to use and about how much of it that you do use if you are making 1.5 pound meatloaf. That way there others can get some ideas on what to do. It's a little sticky. I think I'm gonna add just a little bit of breadcrumb. Don't want to add too much. Give it one more final mix. That's better. Now let's move it over to our pan. So we've got our pan here. Guys, I don't always spray it. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So just use your judgment on that. Sometimes it'll stick a little bit. Get all of your mix onto the pan. Now we need to shape it. Guys, there's always peppers and onions and bread sticking out of my meatloaf. Again, doesn't bother me. It's all gonna bake up together. Usually it ends up in some kind of oval shape. I do try to flatten it so it's even across the top because it'll bake more evenly. And sometimes if there's a piece of bread sticking out, I might chuck it down in there more and flatten it out, but whatever you want to do to it. And at this point, it's ready to go into the oven. So the oven is preheated again at 375 degrees Fahrenheit. I will bake this for about anywhere between 45 and 50 minutes usually, a little longer if it needs it. And then once it comes out of the oven, it's pretty much ready to go. You might want to let it set for a couple minutes. So let's get this baked off and we'll show you what it looks like. Guys, here's our meatloaf, 1.5 pounds of ground chuck. We're keeping it juicy by adding some bell peppers and onions and garlic. We added some gluten-free bread in there that we broke up and put some milk with. We've got an egg in there. All of that stuff is gonna keep this nice and juicy. So let's give it a taste. Meatloaf is not one of those recipes that is super photogenic. I mean that after all, it's a big piece of ground beef sitting on a plate, but that doesn't mean it doesn't taste good. That Worcestershire comes through, the garlic and the onion, the peppers. It's juicy, not dried out at all. Again, I cook it for about 50 minutes. It's perfectly done at that point. But if yours is a little thinner, it may take a little less time, or if yours is a little thicker, it may take another few minutes. So 160 is what you're looking for temperature-wise. We like meatloaf in this house, so like I said, we have it once a month or so. Guys, I hope you give this recipe a try. Please consider subscribing. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on the next video.